Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what I feel is sometimes an underappreciated topic in telecom. There's an old expression that goes, when the roof leaks, when it's raining, the roof leaks, and you can't fix it because it's raining, but when it's not raining, the roof don't leak, so why fix it? Unfortunately, we have seen historically that that has become the attitude now towards many of our critical communications networks. We have some of you may remember back when the traditional telephone network was the primary network and regulated as a utility. We had an emphasis on reliability as new technologies such as mobile have come in. We were reluctant to regulate those in the same way. And when the internet came along, it was quite explicitly what we called a best efforts network, meaning that you made your best efforts to move the information from one place to another, but there was absolutely no guarantee of reliability. Now we fast forward to today, where what was the best efforts network has now subsumed what was the regulated utility network, and we have to ask ourselves: is this still the right approach? Are the benefits of a deregulated and competitive set of networks enough to offset the concerns about network reliability and operation of critical infrastructure in a crisis, or do we need a new approach? And what should that approach be? Fortunately, we have a tremendous panel of experts here to discuss this topic. I'm going to just read a brief biography by way of introduction. Francella Ochillo is the executive director of Next Century Cities. She is an attorney and digital rights activist, has worked on a variety of technology and telecommunications issues. She is represents Next Century Cities on the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee and Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group. Svetlana Matt is the legislative director in the office of Congressman Jerry McNerny. He represents California District 9. She handles his telecommunication technology policy, since he is also co-chair of the Congressional Wi-Fi Caucus and the Artificial Intelligence Caucus. She has tremendous experience with these technical issues, and Congressman McNerny is the co-sponsor, along with Chairman Pallone, of the Network Reliability Act of 2020. Tom Power is Senior Vice President and General Counsel of CTIA, which is the Wireless Association. CTIA used to stand for something, but now it just stands for the Wireless Association, the largest trade association for the wireless industry. Before that, he was U.S. Deputy Chief Technology Officer in the White House, Office of Science and Technology, and Chief of Staff at the National Telecommunications Information Administration, and served at the FCC under FCC Chairman William Kennard. Travis Litman is Chief of Staff and Senior Legal Advisor to FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. Before that, he worked in the FCC in a variety of positions in the Wireline Competition Bureau. He has served as counsel to the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and he has also been in private practice. Finally, Regina Costa is the responsible for the utility. I always forget what TURN stands for. I'm terribly sorry. It's um, but TURN, which is one of the leading consumer protection organizations in California for regulated utilities. She is in charge of their telecommunications issues. She also serves in that capacity as a um, chair of the Telecommunications Committee of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, or NASHUCA, and has been a leading advocate at the California Public Utility Commission on network reliability and telecommunications issues. So, thank you all very much for joining us here today. This very timely uh, topic. We have hurricanes scouring the Gulf Coast. We have enormous bonfires in the West Coast, freak snowstorms in the upper Midwest. And in all of these cases, the role of communications networks, both during the crisis and how long they take and how they perform after the crisis to help in the recovery, cannot be overstated. We particularly now in this time of COVID, if the communications networks go down, we are all crippled in what we can do. So let me start first with Regina. If you can, you're in California, you're in a rural area of California where you actually experience the rolling blackouts as a consequence of the wildfire season there. If you could tell us your experience with wireline and wireless network reliability, is it how do those differ from one another? And generally, how are consumers feeling this in these California crises?
To put this into a little bit of context, I mean, the issue came front and center last October with big fires, lengthy power outages, and a lot of people lost service for a long time. But there were problems before that. 2015 in rural Mendocino County, a truck took out 100 feet of AT&T fiber. All communication in that county was gone. If you needed the internet, forget it. You couldn't transfer hospital records. You couldn't do anything. First responders had no communication. And the same thing applied to the counties on north of that. October 2017 was really when the rubber hit the road on this. That night was terrible. There were very high, hot winds that caused electric equipment to come into contact with trees and brush. A lot of this equipment was owned by the nation's third largest electric utility, private electric utility, PG&E. Some of it was privately owned, but it started 17 fires that were burning across 4 counties. They were very fierce. It was the middle of the night. And part of the damage in these fires was, again, a major AT&T fiber cable that was in Mendocino County on a north-south route. That was the major transport for telecommunications. So anything north of that damage, service was out. And it was out for quite a while. And so that was a huge thing. There were also problems with wireless alerts. People were not getting the alerts. So that's October 2017. So PG&E is faced with a lot of liability. You had 48 people die in those fires, and over 5,000 homes just in Sonoma County burned to the ground. So they're facing liability. Third largest utility in the country goes into bankruptcy. So there had been concern about fires. One of the measures taken was to say, okay, let's proactively de-energize lines. And there was a proceedings at the commission and the legislature saying, what are the implications? How do we deal with this? So that's in play. PG&E is bankrupt. We go into 2019. What happens? There's already a fire burning in Sonoma County, and we have another major event, nasty winds. What happens? PG&E says, we're already in bankruptcy. We do not want to take the risk of our power lines causing any more fires. So we're going to move proactively and shut down all of the power. It wasn't just PG&E, there were Southern California utilities, but 32 counties in California, all of the power was out. That was a lot of people, like tens of millions of people. So what happens is fire blows up. And so in Sonoma County, people are evacuating like crazy. Some of them evacuated more than once because as the fire moved, you had to move. They were opening new centers in Marin. Everybody, I have a home there. I wasn't there, but I got the notice, get out, okay? So as this is going, the power goes out and it stays out and communication starts going out. The VoIP lines all went out, okay? The wireless was spotty. It depended on who your carrier was and it depended on where you were, and it changed over a period of time as backup power ran out. I think the worst day was October 28th when something like 57% of all cell sites were out in Marin. I was in Humboldt, 23% were out, 27% in Sonoma, Calaveras County, 3%. And what happens is it isn't just that the cell site goes out or, okay, X percentage are still working. They don't still work. When you have the same amount of people using fewer cell sites, there's more network congestion. I can testify to the fact that in Humboldt County, cell service slowed to a crawl to the point where it was not usable.
Okay.
And it really depends.
Yeah, I want to bounce now to Travis because so we have these fairly heavy and significant impacts on people when the communications go down. One of the important purposes of the FCC is to monitor these situations and ensure that networks remain functional and reliable. Can you talk a little about what is the current state of the FCC's regulation of these services, and particularly the difference between the traditional Title II services that are still out there and broadband and other services that are currently classified as Title I?
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Harold. Thank you for Public Knowledge for holding this important webinar. It's both timely, as you noted at the outset, and has real consequence, as Regina's comments just made clear. When we look at the FCC's network reliability rules, they're really a function, as actually, Harold, you laid out very well in your prefatory remarks, of the history of communications in this country, in which for well over a century has been rooted in with voice telephony as the centerpiece. Over time, the FCC has adjusted these policies, but for better or for worse, they've really remained voice-centric in nature. So at least from Commissioner Rosenworcel's perspective at the FCC, we have a lot to do to refresh our thinking about what network reliability means when broadband is in fact the technology of our time and of the future. So you can take just one example of what this means with our network outage reporting system, NORS, as it's commonly known as. This is a system that providers are required to report into when they have outages of consequence in terms of reasons for the outage, the root cause analysis and the like at the FCC. But it doesn't apply to broadband services. There's been a proposal outstanding at the FCC for the last 4 years that would in fact apply NORS reporting duties to broadband providers, but it's been stagnant. So for Commissioner Rosenworcel, for her part, would like to see action both on that proceeding, but more broadly, we need to be thinking about how we can update our network reliability rules and policies to reflect that broadband is in fact the technology of our time, whereas voice had been dominant for so many decades and even a century before.
Yep. Great, and let me move on to Svetlana. Obviously, for Representative McNerny, this is a huge issue. So what happens in your office when these disasters are going on and the communications networks go down? And can you tell us a little bit about the Resilient Network Act and how it addresses what you've learned over the last few years?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's really an honor to be a part of this panel and to be a part of this conversation. It's so critically important. I think Virginia did a really good job outlining some of the issues that we've been seeing in California in recent years. And so, from our perspective, the wildfire season is only getting longer. The wildfires are only getting more severe. It couldn't be more clear in terms of the events that we've been seeing this year, with more acreage burn in California and some of the largest wildfires in the state's history as well. And in the having reliable communication during this time for our constituents is so critical. It's the difference between, whether or not somebody can evacuate their house as they are, as a fire is blazing in the middle of the night, and whether they can get an alert, whether they can check on their loved one to make sure that they're okay and they can evacuate, whether somebody can call 911, whether somebody can download evacuation maps as they're trying to evacuate, especially during the pandemic when some of these evacuation routes have had to be altered. And so some of the problems that we've seen in recent years with the wildfires and the impact on communication networks is that there's been a lack of coordination between the communications providers and other parties involved, like the utilities. There's been a lack of information sharing between these parties as well, and a lack of information sharing between the communications providers and public safety officers on the ground and local first responders. And there's also been insufficient backup power. So those things are some of the lessons learned, some of the things we really need to improve. And the Resilient Networks Act, in addition to those things, it also does other things, but some of the critical things that it addresses are the things that I just outlined by requiring that the FCC issue rules to improve information sharing between communication providers and between local first responders, to improve coordination and information sharing between communication providers and the utilities, so that as utilities are getting power back up and running with re-energizing the grid, that they are able to prioritize essential communication networks. And importantly, it also has the FCC in consultation with DHS and DOE ensure that communication providers take reasonable and technically feasible steps so that to ensure that communication providers are integrating backup power into their networks. So those are some of the things that it does. And my boss is going to be also taking a look at what happened this wildfire season and recent wildfire season, and to see how these things can also be strengthened.
Thank you. So, Tom, obviously the industry has not been standing still in all of this. Every one of these disasters has provided lessons. So, two questions for you, if you can combine these. One is, so what is the industry view of disaster preparedness? How is the industry collectively learning and adjusting as climate change intensifies disasters? And what do you think is the appropriate role of the federal governments and local governments, both in disaster preparedness and disaster response, but also in just regular oversight of network reliability? Tom, you're muted.
Thanks. Thank you for that. I'll try to cover all that, but you keep me honest when if I don't respond to all parts of that. But first, thanks for having me on here and for the spotlight on this issue, and appreciate the effort of all the panelists here on what's obviously a critical issue, as you said. It couldn't be more timely just this week, as you mentioned, the Hurricane Zeta, the winter storm in the Midwest, the fires out west, Colorado. 3 of its biggest wildfires were this summer. So this is a problem we're seeing, and if you draw a map of these storms, for example, and a map of electric outages, it's just amazing how devastating these storms can be. Luckily, when you draw the map of the wireless outages, it is a much smaller contained issue than it is to the electric outages. But and clearly the electric utilities have a different network to deal with in terms of their resiliency, but they obviously are facing challenges. And so we try to be there to back them up. And I think, you know, one of the things the industry does is to try to avoid the problem in the first place. The construction of overlapping cell sites so that you have extra capacity. Regina mentioned the congestion issue. You know, the more overlap you can have, the less that's a problem. Certainly generators and batteries for backup power are crucial. And then third, to some extent, when it's possible, redundant fibers would address some of the problems that Regina had talked about. So all of these are potential prescriptive solutions before the problem occurs. And hopefully if you can do that just right, you don't have these problems. But different cell sites have different needs and different limitations that make that harder. And so then the question becomes, what do you do after the fact? And all the carriers have a version of this, but you know, first and foremost, it starts with actually they will start giving unlimited texting and data and voice plans so that customers don't have to worry about that. And then second, it's staging the equipment that they need, the cows and the colts. You guys are familiar with these terms: cells on wheels, cells on light trucks, the flying cows, as we call the drones, up to amphibious vehicles and equipment to clear roadways of the debris, and staging that before the storm hits, working closely with DHS at the federal level and then the local authorities as well to know exactly where to stage those, to stage that kind of equipment. And then it's coordination with each other, which I think you're getting at. And a few years ago, we helped the carriers pull together the Wireless Network Resiliency Cooperative Framework, which addresses things like roaming between the carriers or mutual aid so that they are actually repairing each other's equipment or sharing infrastructure, sharing equipment with each other. And you know, what we've seen through all this, and with better coordination, Svetlana put her finger on it, and we think the Resilient Act hits at a lot of the problems. Coordination between not just carriers, but between carriers and utilities, first responders, federal government, state and local government. And I think everyone's been upping their game the last few years, and we're seeing it in the numbers. You know, just these last few months, Hurricane Laura hit the Gulf Coast, 150-mile-an-hour winds, Category 4 storm. At its worst, we had 84% of cell sites up. That was 92% within a couple of days, and that's exclusive of the extra capacity that is provided by the cows and the colts and the other mobile assets. Hurricane Sally and Delta, we saw the same things. So, you know, I think overall we're obviously investing a lot more time and money, and that's not just the carriers, that's all the stakeholders. We're seeing these improved results, and you know, I have not seen the numbers from Hurricane Zeta yet, but hopefully we'll see even better results there.
Great. So, Francella, the local governments are both users and of communications themselves during these disasters and during the response, and of course have the first level of accountability and responsibility to their local residents. What does the view look like right now from the local government perspective? Is this is the coordination the problem? Should what are you guys experiencing on the ground?
Well, at the beginning of this conversation, you said something really important about the way that we tend to actually treat these issues. Resiliency tends to be a forefront issue for people who are actually in the heart of those emergencies. And then after the fact, it tends to be something we can deal with later. And what we've learned this year is that, you know, it doesn't matter if your infrastructure is on fire, if it is constantly being tested over and over again, if it is underwater, like in Hurricane Maria, if you can't get it back up, all of those situations, they've already happened and they are only getting worse. So we have to be really honest about when's going to be a really good time for us to address resiliency and maybe making it a part of even conditionally, like making it a part of funding strategies, of collaboration strategies, making emergency preparedness a part of our planning. Because as much as we're talking about broadband deployment in general, we also need to be thinking about what's the backup plan. From our conversations with local officials, very often a lot of them are saying, look, we're strapped for resources. So we've done the best that we can, but what do you do when your infrastructure is on fire? Like, what do you do then? And so essentially that relies on having good relationships with your providers. Some of the things that Tom said, I was really excited to hear that about, really making sure that there's a strategy to collaborate on making sure wireless networks are up and other things like that. But at the local level, we really need to make sure that there are resources for local governments to be able to make plans, not just with providers when they're reacting to a crisis, but in planning so that residents and businesses actually know their role in resiliency planning. Because there are a couple of things that federal governments can do, state governments can do, and residents can do on the ground to help support local governments and having some sort of plan. So for example, one of the things that was tossed around in our, internally at our organization, we were talking about what's the plan for when, residents, they don't have anywhere to go, their cell phone towers are down. Are there emergency hubs for internet where they can actually know in any emergency, this is going to come up as soon as hospitals are up, this one comes up next. And really thinking about those types of strategies, not just with the government, but actually thinking about proactive measures that people can take to collaborate with providers, with other stakeholders in this, because there's no way that we're going to be able to solve this problem without new ideas and resources to actually fix it.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to, unless anybody has something they want to specifically respond to what others have said, I'd like to put a question out there for the panel generally. Are there disparate impacts on with network maintenance and network reliability? Do we see, for example, that communities of color are particularly affected by reliability or lack of reliability? Is this are there rural differences as well as urban differences? And if there are disparities, how should we be addressing those?
If I could jump in here with one of those, because I want to expand the call of your question. Essentially, I think the dispositive factor isn't necessarily whether or not you're marginalized, it's actually your income level. Because essentially, people with higher incomes tend to have insurance and things like that to recover from it. If you're in maybe a small town in Louisiana, you've had 5 hurricanes this year in 2020, 5. So that means that, did you have insurance to replace not just your house, but to be able to go out and buy a new cell phone plan and basically have some sort of resiliency plan just for your household? So in places like, for example, Lake Charles, that have been hit over and then rebuilt, then hit over and then rebuilt, when we're thinking about that, those people in the most low income parts of that community, even if there is a government plan, their households are struggling to recover. So when we're thinking about resiliency, it can't just be about have the networks come back up to speed, has local government been able to actually coordinate a response, but being able to make sure that every household can actually benefit from that strategy.
All right, Regina, you're I was just going to turn to you to expand on that.
Yeah, a couple of things. We've looked at this quite a bit in California. When we have had a docket on emergency and disaster relief going since 2018, following up from people losing their homes. So what do you do about that? What do you do about their bills and shutoffs and disconnects, those kinds of things? And that docket evolved into requirements for things like making charging stations available during an emergency, Wi-Fi hotspots, bringing in colts and cows and the extra stuff. How do you deal with bills? How do you deal with the situation where a lot of people who are disabled have to evacuate? How are they notified? When this happens in the middle of a heat wave. It was over 100 degrees here when some of this stuff was going on, both in the north and the south. So we've dealt with that. But the other part that comes into play is, how do you afford this? Because what are people told? You're told, well, go get some backup power so your cell phone doesn't die. Well, who can afford what? And who can afford to take the time to really research, well, how much does this backup power last? How does it work? It's expensive. If you're on a low income, you're not necessarily going to be able to go to Staples and buy a humongous battery. The other thing, to sort of circle back to one of Travis's points about, the support for the copper networks and things. Copper networks were great in this situation, provided you were directly connected to the central office. we're talking about rural areas and the disproportionate impact. A lot of these places are served off of remote terminals. They're the very long lines that connect to a box that the telephone company takes all those calls and transmits them to the central office. Those boxes rely on commercial power. So when the power is out, and particularly for an extended period of time, the copper lines go out. They went out all over rural California. The batteries, we know, were not replaced. They were 10 years old. You know, and so stuff on the table at the California Commission is beefing up the battery capacity in those remote terminals. Otherwise, your copper line's not going to work. But for rural areas, if you check the CPUC website, one of the things we pushed for and got was an examination of the state of the wireline networks of AT&T and Verizon, now Frontier. And that study is released. They've been letting it out chapter by chapter while they resolve confidentiality disputes. They've just basically dismissed all the rest of them. We're commenting on that. But that study will show that those networks were not maintained. And those are the same people on these long copper lines where there is no fiber, and they're in locations where if there is wireless there, it's spotty. If you go around the wrong corner, you lose a signal. And so they're locations where you cannot depend on wireless for your emergency alerts in high fire threat areas. So those are disparities in the situation that really have to be rectified.
Right. So, Travis, your boss, Commissioner Rosenworcel, has been a huge champion of greater FCC action in this area, both in terms of information collection about these issues and others. What do you think the FCC could do more of and do better in terms of its responses to these disasters?
Sure. So we need to make sure that our restoration and recovery responses are fair to everyone. So for this reason that Commissioner Rosenworcel has called on the agency to refresh its disaster playbook. And I think that starts, and this gets a little bit at your prior question, with making sure we have standardized policies across the board for what happens in the wake of a disaster. That includes everything from after event investigations, field hearings, reports, and then utilization of the agency's public policy tools to affect policy changes to learn from our disasters. She's not entirely alone in this thinking. I think just last month, the Disaster Reporting Act passed the House of Representatives, which would actually compel the agency to standardize some of these practices. I think it's an appropriate place to start, is looking at the agency's standard operating procedures for both post-disaster, post-resiliency issues, to make sure that it's pursuing its policies fairly, because everyone, no matter who they are, where they live, deserves the same response out of the government.
So, Tom and Svetlana, I want to ask you both a specific question about these disparities. We saw what happened with Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria, and one of the responses which got some eye rolls was when the president apparently realized for the first time that Puerto Rico was an island and it was difficult to get things out there. There are a lot of areas like Puerto Rico. Some of them are island communities, some of them are more remote communities where we need it seems that they have a lot of specific issues. Both from a sort of legislative perspective, but also from the industry perspective. Do we need different rules and different standards for these geographically isolated or hard to reach areas?
Sure, I'll jump in. Your question and a couple of the prior comments get to just the economic impact here, and this goes beyond the emergencies situations. The COVID pandemic has exposed the challenge so many of our students face, young students, where they are now supposed to be educating from home, where they don't have enough connectivity. Obviously, there have been government programs addressing this for years, the Lifeline program at the FCC, as well as other programs such as at the Agriculture Department. In the wake of these emergencies, obviously, we take some steps to try to help in terms of making free voice data and text available, The FCC is looking at pushing subsidies out to more rural areas, and you guys know all the challenges there with mapping challenges and all that. But fundamentally, for the carriers, obviously the challenge is it's just not economically viable to serve some of these rural areas without some help. So definitely that's a way to think about it. But in the emergency situation, what we know is you grab your phone. It's the mobility that counts. Certainly, landlines can save lives, broadcasters can save lives, but you need that mobility to really be secure. And that's with low income consumers, again, more likely to be mobile only or wireless only. So I definitely agree that focusing on the financial needs of these communities has got to be a key part of this. So,
Svetlana, anything to add? Is this a budgeting issue? Is this about earmarking funds specifically for emergency preparedness, perhaps also relating to climate change, or are there other responses that Congress ought to consider as well to these sorts of situations?
Yeah, well, I think that as we are thinking about any sort of broadband deployment, it is really critical that resiliency is made a part of that. And HR 2, the Moving Forward Act, which the Congressman co-sponsored in the House passed, ensures that resiliency and reliability are made a part of the funding that is made available through the reverse auction for broadband deployment. Specifically with respect to Puerto Rico, and our territories, I think it's really critical that we have a strong national framework that protects areas like Puerto Rico, and that's something that we should really make a priority. And also, I should flag that in the Resilient Networks Act, something that it also includes is that it directs the GAO to conduct an audit of the FCC's 2017 response to the hurricane season in Puerto Rico, and to put forward findings and recommendations, and it requires the FCC to then issue or conduct a proceeding based on that. So I think that we also really need to re-examine and to take a close look at what happened and lessons learned.
So we've talked about disaster recovery and resilience, but I want to ask you all about what are called sunny day outages, where a network goes offline when there's no apparent reason for it. Most recently, we saw this with T-Mobile, and the FCC issued a report on T-Mobile's nationwide outage. We've seen this with CenturyLink, which had a multi-day, multi-state outage. We've seen multi-state 911 outages. How does this happen? I mean, how is it that I read the T-Mobile report, and it seemed to me that this would have been funny if it weren't so deadly serious. So, how is it that we are in a situation where these outages can occur, and what should we be doing about them? Let me start with Travis, and then I'll work around.
Sure, thank you. So, the T-Mobile report is an interesting read, and I'd recommend it to anyone who's interested in not only FCC policy, but these topics generally. It was the right call for the Bureau to actually investigate and issue a report here. And what you'll read in the report is a description of the root cause analysis of the outage, the attempts to remediate the outage, the cascading consequences within the network. And then you'll see a description of the changes or of the impact of this outage. And we learned that tens of thousands of calls to 911 failed. We learned that during this time, there were some folks who wrote to the agency how they missed job interviews because of this outage, and even one woman who was stranded by the roadside for several hours. So it's just a healthy reminder of how important our networks are. But we also need to take from these types of reports a couple of things. First, we need to standardize the investigations and reports like this after sunny day outages, like the FCC has done a couple of times, but we just need to make it standard operating procedure across the board. But we can't stop there. We need to actually follow through to make sure that what the lessons learned are in these reports actually carry some weight. Whether if CISRIC's best practices aren't being followed, the agency needs to dig in and discover why, and if any policy changes are going to need to be made to correct that so that these outages don't happen again.
So go ahead, Francella, you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add something really quickly to that. I think that it's really important for us to, I cannot reiterate enough. I am so with Travis on this idea of standardizing what happens when we're documenting this, but also to say what policy changes are required, because essentially, local officials are in a place where they go to the grocery store with their constituents, they go to church with them, their kids are in the same school. There's no smoke and mirrors when it comes to, I need you to fix this. And so when you're responding to this emergency, they're in it with their residents, but at the same time, they're also the most cash-strapped and under-resourced entity. So the thing is, this is a great opportunity for not only the federal government, but also state governments to say, here to model, actually, like these are really good resiliency plans. Here's a good methodology for emergency preparedness. If your municipality doesn't have enough funding for it, you can apply for resiliency grant funding through X. And so to really make that a priority, and even when the FCC and state governments are offering funding opportunities for providers, ask them to actually provide what is your resiliency plan, to actually make that a condition of funding. Because even if nothing else, maybe you're in an area where they haven't had any hurricanes recently. I don't think earthquakes are an issue. Actually forcing people to ask the questions is a really important part of being prepared.
Right. So, Tom, let me ask you, and I'm going to press you a little bit here. One of the things that comes up constantly in these FCC reports is that these are voluntary standards and best practices. And in the T-Mobile report, they list several best practices that were ignored by the crew. Should we still be leaving these to voluntary and best practices, or isn't it time for regulatory enforcement to be available, or liability lawsuits to give companies the incentive to keep their personnel trained and to follow best practices for fear of liability?
So, Harold, on the T-Mobile issue, Chairman Pai summed it up pretty well with one word: failure. Right? That's what it was. It was a failure. And Travis is right that you read that report, you understand all about it, and it's always that's always the appropriate role to review what happened and to fix it. And T-Mobile has implemented the fixes so that it doesn't happen again. This is an industry that competes on these issues. You can see the TV advertisements. You can see it in their regulatory filings. They actually will explain why they are the superior network. The industry, the wireless industry, invests $25 to $30 billion a year in their networks, and some of that is resiliency, some of that is further deployment, some of that is mobile edge computing and other advances. It is more money than any other industry, any other operational industry invests every year. So, when you talk about liability or regulation, I mean, we all want to get to the same end. Everyone has the same incentive to get to the same end. We think best practices gives just the added flexibility to give the exact right response. And frankly, liability or regulations don't necessarily add to the incentive. They have all the incentives they need. There was nobody at T-Mobile after that outage saying, yeah, but on the other hand, right? That was a failure, as Chairman Pai called it, and they are taking all the steps they need to replace it. We think that's the right path. And I would add on Francella's point, the assistance to the local authorities is so important, and there is some available, not as much financially, of course, as they'd probably like, but just in terms of coordination, and DHS in particular, who we work with a lot, we see examples where the local governments just aren't aware of what is available from them, just from a coordination and education standpoint. And so, whether it's working with them or coordination with the other stakeholders, that is also a big part of that.
Regina, I wanted to ask you a question from the audience that dovetails with this, and will give you a chance to respond as well to any of the comments Tom or others were making. So what role do you envision for state PUCs on monitoring and enforcing standards and responding to these issues, especially when the source is outside of the state for some of these sunny day issues? I mean, the source of this was Atlanta, Georgia, but it had impacts, throughout the country. What's the role of the California PUC in something like this?
I think states have a huge role in this. I mean, I'm much more familiar with the CenturyLink 911 outage, which, I mean, mainly clobbered Washington state, but also hit some areas of California. I mean, it was a piece of equipment in Denver or somewhere in Colorado. Okay, it still affected intrastate communication, and the PUC has an obligation under statute, and I would guess that virtually every PUC does, about public safety and about the essential nature of communications and the role that it plays in their state. And maybe they don't have authority to take an action, depends on the state. California certainly does, but they can certainly investigate. And I'm remembering the Derecho report where it was Virginia who took on the task of investigating the Verizon 911 outage, and the FCC commending Virginia for the work that they did at the state level because it informed their investigation. And the same thing happened with the CenturyLink 911 outage. Phil Jones was sitting at the dais at the FCC when that investigation was being discussed. So states have a big role. And I want to disagree a little bit with Tom on the best practices. I mean, I will note that the communication outages in October 2019 took place less than a month after the carriers had assured the commission that their networks were very resilient and capable of functioning during disasters. And not you, but the carriers had made the same sort of statements to the FCC. And that did not fly with our commissioner, with our commission, with our legislators, with the director of OES. And the California Commission and the legislature have stepped in. Mike McGuire, the senator representing the district I'm sitting in, where a lot of these fires took place, introduced a bill to require reporting to OES for outages in little communities that don't come close to meeting a NORS threshold, community isolation outages. This commission has adopted requirements for network resiliency. It will adopt them for wireline. We're waiting for that one, but they did it for wireless, where they're requiring 72 hours of backup power. They're requiring network resiliency plans with specific information that is to be included, explaining what equipment is in networks, what equipment relies on commercial power, what are the plans for taking care of that if there's a problem, is there a place that it can't be bolstered, please explain that to us, so that they can identify the potential problems in networks. If you're going to ensure that service is reliable, which they have a statutory obligation to do, you have to have that information. It also includes requirements for providing points of contact with emergency services officials, both the state level and I think, fuzzy on my memory on this one, but also local. It also requires information to the public on websites. And one thing in there that we believe should happen, and I don't know if they're going to do this on the wireline side or not, but if you have new construction or you're rebuilding facilities that have been destroyed, incorporate resiliency in that construction. That's the time to put in a standby generator. Like things of this nature, there are things that definitely can be done. In that docket, the cable industry has come in and said, look, we may not be able to retrofit our entire networks, but we can certainly bolster the backup power at critical nodes. We'll take that. There are a lot of things that can be done. It is not all within the purview of a state commission to do it. It's got to be a collaborative effort with the providers, with local authorities, with the legislature. If I'm a community services district and I'm doing something and I'm thinking about a microgrid, okay, coordinate. Can this be used as backup power to bolster the local cable or the local VoIP network? Things like this.
So one of the things I'm hearing is that whether it's voluntary or mandatory, coordination is certainly key in our very complex communication environment. And I wanted to get one last audience question in as we're 10 minutes till the end of the panel, but this is a very timely question. So how has the pandemic impacted the ability to coordinate among the industry, government, stakeholders, and particularly at a time when we are even more reliant than ever on our communications networks? What what needs to be done here that's new because of COVID in terms of coordination as well as in terms of preparation?
Harold, I can jump in with one response to that, which what COVID revealed was in the early days when governors and other officials were trying to figure out who's essential, who can be out. Some of our companies were running into problems because just going out and doing standard repairs, was that okay? Could the retail stores be open? You think, well, it's just a store, maybe it doesn't have to be open, but if folks, their phone is dead or they need a charger, that's where they come and get it. And so we had a lot of success actually working with DHS, who went through a list of what was deemed essential and what was not, communicating that to governors. It was voluntary. It was guidance to the states, but it was very helpful in trying to get everybody on the same page. And that kind of coordination, is even more important in the face of a natural disaster.
Right. Anybody else want to address that?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in really quickly to actually elevate something that Travis brought up earlier about reorienting emergency preparedness around broadband instead of telephone connectedness. A lot of emergency response plans, or at least local ones in either small and even like mid-sized cities, really still rely on you being able to communicate via telephone or even radio to be able to, get even local TV to be able to get out the message. And the truth is, especially during COVID, people are required to be able to work and learn from home. So we're going to have to make sure that our emergency plans actually accommodate that. And so the thing is, it means that not only do we have to make sure that people can get back onto networks, it also means making sure that the third of the country that's struggling with reliable access can actually get online.
So we're coming down to the last few minutes. I want to thank you all for participating in this panel here. I want to just give each of you 1 minute to answer this question. If there's one thing you want folks listening to take away from this panel on network resilience and network reliability, what would it be? And I'll run this in reverse order from when I started. So Francella, you go first.
I think that when we're thinking about how to address this problem, that, I personally think that we always have to make sure that policy is not only based on good numbers, but also compassion. And very often the people who are having to deal with these national disasters are also dealing with housing insecurity, food insecurity. There are a lot of layers that they're dealing with. So making sure that they can get back on their communications networks is something that has far-reaching impact and can actually be a part of actually just a compassionate response from the government. So if nothing else, I really hope that the federal government takes more of a role in terms of modeling what are good practices and here are the resources that are available to you. And that also state governments actually, even if they don't have the resources, can actually be able to tout these are plans that worked that could actually help people in other parts of the country.
Great. Thanks. Tom?
To me, I think it's how much agreement there is across everyone here. We all agree on what the problem is. We all agree on what the solution looks like, right? We believe in backup power. We believe in generators. We believe in contingency planning. We're all aiming in the same direction. And we come down to this narrow question that you put your finger on, Harold. Do the costs and unintended consequences of regulation outweigh the benefits? And, clearly that's where we think it is. And I could tick through that California order and talk about some of the things where it seems not in the best interest of consumers to be pursuing these things and subjecting folks to liability for things that aren't really relevant to what we're trying to solve. But the good news about this panel, what it reveals is we really all are rowing in the same direction. I think we all know what the solution looks like, and I think just continued collaboration and communication is what's going to drive the right solutions here.
Great. Svetlana?
This is something that just cannot wait. This is something that we need to be prioritizing right now and doing everything possible to really be addressing, just given the extreme weather patterns that we're seeing with climate change, longer and more severe hurricane seasons, longer and more severe wildfire seasons. We need to be taking all immediate action right now. Just to quickly piggyback on some of the points were made earlier as it relates to this, the pandemic has only made that more clear, because now as local first responders are trying to get this information that from our constituents' perspective, maybe they're going to have to evacuate differently or go to different locations than before because of the pandemic and the unique challenges there. The first responders need to be able to deliver that information and know who has and who doesn't have self-service. So there's just a lot more anxiety among our constituents when it comes to how, with just the things that they're seeing on the ground with wildfires and the extreme weather patterns right now that are happening, but the pandemic combined on top of that. And so that's when it's things like making sure that there is adequate backup power, making sure that there is the necessary information sharing going on, making sure that there is the coordination that's needed among all the parties involved. We need to be addressing that right now and taking all steps possible to do that.
Great, thanks. Travis?
To pick up on a point that Svetlana was making, but also to take a step back, ultimately we have a choice. We can wait for disasters to occur and put in place resiliency policies after the fact, after we already have a mess, after consumers have already been cut off. Or we can think about it upfront in every way. We can think about how safety and security should be built into our thinking, our policies on the front end of things. And so I guess that's where I would leave it.
Great. Regina?
I mean, I would echo that and just add, something we said in our opening comments on this last round of network resiliency, which it was a quote from Vince Lombardi, that if you chase perfection, you might not get it, but you can achieve excellence. And there may not be the perfect solution that's available in the short term, but you can do a heck of a lot, and you can set the stage to really thoroughly address these things and put ourselves in a position to adjust as we go.
Well, that certainly sounds like a great note to end on here. I just want to add that, like Tom, I'm struck by the amount of agreement that this is an issue that needs to be elevated and acted on. That there's a tremendous need for future planning. That there's a wide number of stakeholders outside of the traditional industry players that need to be brought in to these discussions at the local level, at the state and federal level. I want to, and one of the most important questions, though, that still remains unanswered is who's going to pay for it and how are we going to pay for it? That's worth a panel on its own, but unfortunately, we don't have time to address that critical issue. So I just want to thank all of you for giving us your time today and participating in this panel, and thank all of you who have been watching and attending this panel for your attention on this absolutely critical issue.